I can't believe I'm going to open by quoting Sigmund Freud, so forgive me, but in 1895, he said, "I think this man is suffering from memories." Oh, come on, it was funnier than that. And you have both also said that the trauma isn't the event, it's the response. Bessel, let's start with you. Can you at least give us a landscape of even the concept of trauma, which was resisted as a diagnosis for a long time? Even just tell us what trauma is.
Trauma
medically, scientifically.
Is an event, a series of events that basically leave you completely helpless in terms of being able to respond to it. So the big thing about trauma is overwhelming. Unlike a stress, when the stress is over, you can feel better. When you're traumatized, it comes into you and gives you a deep sense of powerlessness and helplessness, and that stays about, and you don't recover from that. So you stay in that state of terror, helplessness, and fear. Yeah.
And Rachel, would you say that's the same definition you would give, or assessment?
Not exactly,
Okay.
but close. I would say that trauma is a watershed that divides your life into a before and after.
Yep.
Does it always fill you with fear, terror? Certainly when it happens, that's true. But then for many people, for most people, that fear and terror goes away and it's replaced by other things, lessons learned. And so sometimes a traumatic experience can be the source ultimately of great accomplishment and wisdom and transformation. But getting there is painful. And in order to get there, you very often have to undergo some pretty unbearable symptoms and self-reflection and really an existential reckoning with how you're going to live in a world that so shatters your expectations. So I agree with you on that part. I also just want to say that trauma is not a diagnosis.
Yeah, so tell me about that.
So the diagnosis that is most often linked with trauma is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is one out of many different kinds of psychiatric or psychological consequences that can occur. But the idea behind post-traumatic stress disorder is that it's a response that you keep having, even though ostensibly you should have gone through the stages. Almost everyone that is undergoing a trauma will look like they have the symptoms of PTSD at the time, in the short term, in a few days and weeks, maybe even months after. And we don't really consider that a disorder. We just consider that your body kind of figuring out how to digest or accept the blow that it has sustained. But the idea behind the diagnosis of PTSD was, well, wait a minute, it's 10 years later, it's 20 years later, it's 30 years later, and I still haven't done what everyone said I would do, which is get over it. I still feel that these effects are with me, and I've been changed, and I don't think that I can go back.
So you do think
Can I
it's
say
not
something
the
about
event?
it?
Yes, Bessel.
There's another dimension here, and that is that people can split off parts of themselves. And so part of you may feel terrified and isolated, and part of you can become luminous. My heroes are people like Isaac Newton, who had a horrendous childhood, was a pretty crazy guy, and he invented mathematics and physics. J.K. Rowling.
Are you associating those two things?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. No, I think the people who really change the world are people who come from an unbearable situation where they have no choice but to change the world. I think some of the greatest minds have been traumatized people. And sometimes you don't know how traumatized they are until you sleep with them.
Okay, I was going to make a really inappropriate joke. I'm not only editing it out of the video, I'm editing it out of tonight. So do you agree that the traumatized person is suffering from memories?
No, I wouldn't say that. The traumatized person is suffering from reactions.
It's the response,
So
Rachel,
when we
as you
created
said.
diagnosis of PTSD, we had to connect it with memories of the war because it had to be about Vietnam. But what we didn't focus on is that trauma changes your brain and your perceptions. And so you don't remember it necessarily. People who blow up, people who don't feel anything, people get terrified, don't say, oh, the memory of my rape or the memory of my abuse is coming back. No, we get so mad at when people do that. They don't know the connection with that and their past. In the VA, people make that connection because otherwise you don't get disability. But in the civilian life, people don't make those connections.
Now, you study a lot of veterans with PTSD, but I didn't mean to interrupt you. What was your thought? Let you follow up.
I mean, just to stay with the memories thing, I mean, I think that traumatic memories are part of what happens to people who are exposed to trauma. And when we talk about a traumatic memory, generally we're talking about not conjuring up the event, like now I want to remember what happened, but a memory that decides to come when it comes or when something triggers the memory, and also that it's accompanied by kind of a physiologic fight or flight response that is reminiscent of what you might have experienced at the time of the trauma. Now think about that, that's really unusual. I mean, most people in this room, according to statistics, 90% of the people here have been exposed to what would count as a life-threatening, potentially traumatic event, and you probably remember it really well. But again, according to statistics, most people who have experienced that kind of event will be able to look back and say, oh, was I scared? My heart was beating so fast. I couldn't get over it for so long. But as they say it, they're not feeling it. But when you have PTSD or when you have another kind of a mental health condition that suggests that the trauma is still very much in the center of the stage of your consciousness, then when you think about the memory or when the memory decides to come, your body is also remembering what happened almost it's not detached, it's obviously linked, but almost like the body is having its own process that is linked to the memory of the event. However, when you think about it from really the perspective of why we would have traumatic memories after we experience a trauma, in a sense, this is a very adaptive thing, because what's supposed to happen after we're really traumatized? We're supposed to learn something. We're supposed to learn about danger in the world, in the environment. You know, if you're walking down the street and you're assaulted, you won't walk down that street again, not in the same way, not without really minding your step. And so a traumatic memory is kind of the ultimate teacher in a certain way. The problem is that you can be too good of a student and overlearn. And so the challenge is to learn just the right amount, have the memory, take the lesson, but not have the body in control of how you experience that lesson.
You both talk about the biological basis and of trauma and also everything cognitive. And so I want to ask kind of a very generalist question. I don't know if this will make you bristle, but this distinction between mind and brain, do you think that that is a false distinction? Is the mind the brain? Are we solely discussing biology? I mean, you both discussed sort of biological damage that happens in the brain when traumatized.
You know, our population is somewhat different. We see a lot of kids, we see a lot of domestic violence, we see a lot of people who have adult problems with intimacy, and what we see is people who really don't know where their symptoms come from. And they don't have memories particularly. They have reactions that keep happening, basically. And, you know, we saw a little one-year-old kid when we were upstairs here. And to me, what happens in kids as they go, just fascinating, had every week a kid is a different kid. Do we know the precise brain processes that makes a kid move from one phase to another? No, we don't. But we know a little bit about some of the neural circuitry, but our minds sort of get built on top of that. But we can't study symbolic processes. And we're not really equipped at this point in time to know about how meaning-making systems in the brain, and we basically are meaning-making creatures. So we have certain biological responses, but we have meaning-making systems on top of that that are above biology in a way.
How do you mean above
Let's
biology?
see what Lisa...
Rachel, do you think that there's a layer above biology, or is it all molecular biology, genetics, chemicals, neurons?
When you're exposed to a traumatic challenge, your body will react. So the question is, does your body react because you interpreted the danger? Or did you interpret the danger because of how your body reacted? And this is an age-old debate. This is the whole, origins of psychology with James and Cannon and all those people. And, the debate hasn't been resolved because both things are true. Both things happen, maybe not at the exact same time, but a lot of the information we get about how we feel is driven by how we interpret our biology, but also how our biology works is very much about what we tell ourselves, like, oh no. And so...
But our culture helps us to interpret it. Culture is very powerful in how we interpret it.
That's right. So who's in the driver's seat?
Yeah.
And, and even if sometimes, sometimes the driver's your feelings and cognitions and motions, and sometimes it's your body. I think that both of those things are true. Can we switch drivers? Or can we use our techniques to say, oh, my body is under fight or flight. What's triggering me? What's happening? And then use that to be able to say, you know what? It's probably a traumatic trigger, but I'm safe. So maybe I don't need to feel this way anymore. Or conversely, you might see something and then say, oh my, this is going to be happening all over again. But maybe also talking yourself down from that.
See, I think a lot of this depends on the culture we live in. And the big advance in our culture we've lived in the past 20 years, 30 years, has been neuroscience. So what we have discovered in neuroscience is very exciting, and we have learned something about the brain, and so that's what we focus on. When I was a student, we actually thought a lot about the mind. We studied Piaget, and we studied how kids evolve their minds. That whole study of the mind has disappeared from our culture. And
now it has.
And part of the reason why we're excited in the research that we both are engaged in with psychedelic therapies, I think psychedelic therapies may bring the mind back into our field, and we may actually become very curious about what the hell happened. Did we change people's biology? Maybe not so much, but we change people's meaning-making systems profoundly with the therapies that we do here now. Yeah.
I want to go back to the question that you asked, because you talked about the brain as being damaged, or our biologic changes as being damaging. And really all we've demonstrated is that there are biologic changes, that there are changes in the brain, and there are changes in a lot of molecular. You can see them, you can measure them. That's what's so interesting about, the one thing that is controversial here is...
They were disappointed that it wasn't going to be controversial enough.
Well, Bessel and I, we agree on many things, and we always have. Most things, not everything. You'll see that.
Maybe
sure.
not.
We just got to ask the right question.
Tonight. Wait.
What? Do you know the people you slept with?
But we do agree on a lot of things. But where there's actual controversy, I think, is not in whether there is the biologic change, because you can see those things, you can quantitate them. The controversy is in what you're seeing. What is it that you're looking at? And so the Western culture sees a change and says, ooh, damage, it shouldn't be this way. But that is not necessarily how to interpret biologic change. Change is change. Now, how many people here think change is a bad word? I mean, most people think change is a good word. At best, it's a neutral word.
Yeah, and I think we should talk about the work of our mutual friend Marty Teicher here, who has done prospective studies about people who had certain traumas at different ages. He finds very predictable brain changes in the way, in both the people who got affected and the people who didn't get affected. And the changes were...
They're contagious?
Yeah,
The
at
changes
certain
are
age, so the brain
contagious?
has traumas at different ages, has different effect on brain development because the brain is developing.
What kind
organ.
of changes
But-
are we talking about?
Oh, change in amygdala, connectivity patterns, frontal lobe, dorsal lobe, prefrontal cortex, all these different systems get changed by the brain, yeah. But the question is that we also are amazingly adaptive people. So people who have horrendous trauma histories, their brains may look the same as people who have horrendous symptoms, but they're sometimes asymptomatic. So there's some adaptation has been made. We see this a lot in our neurofeedback programs. These people's brains are very unusual, but they still function because we are a very resilient species who can live with very messed up brains sometimes.
Well, I can give you maybe another analogy that to just jump off of that. You know, when you have an infection, right, and your white blood cell count is high, and you might have a fever, you don't feel very well, you can take the high white blood cell count as a barometer of, oh no, this must mean I'm sick. But what's really happening is that the white cell count is high because your body's trying to fight off something, right? What you don't want to do is kill the white blood cells.
That's right.
That's for sure. And yet in neuroscience, we tend to really be very reductionist. We see a change. Oh, the amygdala is firing in fear. That's not good. The amygdala shouldn't fire. Well, of course it should. Think of the alternative. You don't want to have a smoke alarm in your brain that
Right.
doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because if
And that happens to
there's
people too.
smoke,
Yeah.
you want to have that annoying
Yeah.
sound. And so we have to be really respectful of biologic changes that are observed in the context of real life situations that require a response from our bodies. Now, to be sure, inflammation is not a pleasant experience, but the alternative of not being able to fight off infection is even worse. So the problem with the brain, in my opinion, is that we sometimes use those fMRIs like Rorschachs. You know, we imbue them with interpretations that, you know, may or may not reflect the accurate reality. So yes, stress does cause this change, but is it like a white blood cell kind
Right.
of change? Or is it, oh my gosh, I'm being damaged kind of change?
Yep.
And that's the conversation that we need to be having more in our field, because you don't want to give people the idea that when they have a measurable, detectable biologic change, that they need to worry about that per se. So the question of the mind versus the body or something like that is that it's sometimes very convenient to just don't worry about the brain for a minute. Let's talk about the process, right? And in psychiatry, over the years, because we have advanced and gotten so many really cool molecular tools and brain tools, and we can measure and quantitate, you know, we've tended to not have those conversations. And those are the conversations that we really need to be having. We have to put the psych back in psychiatry.
Right.
Because we've really
Applause,
gone away
applause.
from that.
So,
Applause. Like,
Thank you, Bessel.
get the mind back into psychiatry, absolutely.
And psychology.
Bessel, if you don't mind, just to catch up, not everyone in the audience will be as well versed in the parts of the brain and the different functions. Can you just give us a lightning review of the amygdala, why that keeps coming up in conversation?
Why the brain is coming up?
No, the amygdala, specifically.
Well, you know, amygdala became a big focus of attention because Joe did this wonderful work in New York about the amygdala. The amygdala became the big thing, But today we know it's probably more the periaqueductal gray, which is a little bit further down in the brain. I call it the cockroach part of your brain, very primitive part of your brain, that if you're traumatized, that fires all the time. You're always active, like, is there danger? And if you're not traumatized, it goes to rest. That's even below the amygdala. So we know what we happen to study. So you're astrophysicists, great, because you guys know that what you could see with the Hubble telescope is completely different what you can see with the Webb telescope. And your whole universe becomes a different universe once you have a different tool. And we are still at the level of Galileo at this point.
Yes, I love that you made that analogy. We've got the Hubble Space Telescope, this unbelievable satellite, and you're still on the ground grinding lenses. No, but it's wonderful. But I also, it reminds me that I read from both of you that psychedelics in specific, people were framing in analogy precisely to the telescope, that psychedelics were to the mind what the telescope is to astronomy, or what the microscope is to biology. Do you disagree with that?
Yeah, the psychedelics clearly can do things to one's consciousness that can expand your consciousness and become more aware of the relative role that you play in a larger universe. And so the nature of trauma is you get really, you feel too much, your emotions want to show, and you try to control yourself. So traumatized people tend to become quite constricted and work a lot, very hard on keeping themselves under control. And on psychedelics, people tend to open up their hearts and their minds, and they are able to look at themselves, including a lot of traumatic material. That's often very painful, but at the end, people say, that was awful what I went through, but it happened when I was 18 years old, and that's the best I could do as an 18-year-old, or as a 4-year-old, or 8-year-old. And the psychedelics give people a sense of perspective, which is an incredibly interesting phenomenon. And what's also interesting is that psilocybin seems to do it, and MDMA seems to do it, and ketamine seems to do it. They're all very different chemical substances, but they all seem to have similar psychological effects of allowing yourself to feel what you feel without getting overwhelmed by it.
Do you agree?
And
you study let's just be clear, you study
Yes.
the both biological basis and the psychological basis of
Yes.
treatments with psychedelics with very traumatized people.
yes, we're doing clinical trials as well as biomarker studies, epigenetic, and imaging and all that. And the quote that you stated, it was really by the psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, who said, when used properly, psychedelics can be to psychiatry or the brain what the telescope is to astronomy or the microscope is to biology. And it's, I think, one of the most profound things that have been said about psychedelics, because what Dr. Grof is saying is that these are tools. And that is not the conversation we are having in the popular culture about psychedelics. The conversation is evolving into the pharmacologic properties, the serotonin receptors, what it does to the brain, and the power of the medicine itself to activate brain areas that will passively change you. But what the quote is about, what I think I agree with Bessel, that is that you have to use it for the purpose of examining something that you are having a difficult time seeing without being able to look that clearly. You can't see that star without the telescope. There's something in your consciousness that you know is there, you have a feeling it's there, you just can't quite access it. So if you take a psychedelic in the proper way, with the proper facilitation, preparation, integration, in the context of an overall therapy where you've been working on this for a while, you might be able to have that insight. The psychedelic puts you in a state that will optimize your ability to have introspection and insight, and also be kind to yourself as you bring up difficult material, the self-compassion. So it's really a tool. And if you understand it as a solution and not a tool, then I think ultimately we will be disappointed with the psychedelic renaissance, which I would hate to see, because I think why these other medications and strategies haven't worked is because they've been administered with such passivity. I'm going to give you a drug and you will swallow it. Or, we will do these steps to heal. Follow me, right? And really, with psychedelics, there's a different opportunity of having the patient lead the way, find something. Oh, wait, I just saw something, I want to stop. I wonder if it's important. It's not the trauma that I thought I had. It's something about what happened when I was 6 years old. I'm going to stop here and tell you what that is, and maybe we'll connect the dots, maybe we won't, but it's patient-driven, and that is a beautiful new thing, really old thing in mental health.
So therapy is very much a dialogue between two people. And we always change, as we do right now, we adjust what we say to each other. And so it's very hard to speak your truth without a context that you're talking in. And psychedelics allow you to go deep inside and meet yourself, not necessarily with the judgment of people around you. And so it would be very common for a person to go deep inside, and oftentimes very painful stuff comes up that they have not gone before. They don't get the courage from the outside to do so, but to suddenly have an image of themselves of being beaten by their father when they're 3 years old. And you see that happening, and you go, oh, that poor kid. No wonder that the kid became so scared of everybody. No wonder I was so scared of my classmates. No wonder I didn't have friends because I was always afraid. Oh, that poor kid who couldn't make friends because his father was beating him. And now I understand why I feel so defensive with my wife when she becomes angry with me, because it reminds me of my dad beginning to beat me. And people sort of rearrange their internal reality in a very profound way.
But they need help to do it, Bessel.
Yeah.
So the chances that you will do this by taking a psychedelic in your living room is not really not the same kind of
Or we'd all be
outcome.
cured. Let's face it.
No,
Well,
I think,
we would.
This is our
this
big
is
issue
really
right
the
now.
important thing.
Yeah,
What Bessel just talked about were a lot of steps and a lot of process that then has to be brought together and connected. So the person doesn't do all of that connecting on their own. There's a midwife there. You have to push, but somebody's got to catch it. So.
And we are very passionate about it.
That's really
so
important. That, again, you don't just have... a lot of people do take psychedelics and say, oh, now I understand how the universe was created, and I understand everything about me. And, that's great.
Until the next day.
But when you're suffering from a really serious mental health condition, and PTSD is a serious mental health condition, and if you came by it because you were really exposed to some horrific stuff, like the kind of stuff that's going on in the world today, that takes some work in processing. That doesn't spontaneously pop to the surface. That requires a lot of holding by someone that can hold it, somebody that can be the container, and somebody that can help you link it. And it's really the most important thing to say about psychedelics, that they're tools. You can buy a surgical knife, but you're not going to cut yourself open and take out, your appendix that burst. And psychedelics really is the same, that it's a tool that needs to be administered. I'm not saying what degree you have, medical, not medical. I'm just saying that somebody that knows how to use the tool and what the tool is has to be there to kind of facilitate the process if the idea is a mental health healing.
That's it. I do want to ask, Bessel, I know in your book you talk about this, and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing too glibly, but essentially the failure of a lot of psychoactive drugs that kind of seized the field, Prozac and a lot of the derivatives. Do you still feel that way, that a lot of those drugs seized the field, stopped other research, and kind
absolutely.
of froze it?
Yeah, no, I did the first,
And that they're failures?
I did the first studies on Prozac and Zoloft for PTSD. So I used to be a very respectable person because as a psychiatrist who give drugs.
You did used to
And
be.
I saw they didn't work all that well. And I started doing things like yoga. And my colleagues said, oh, he's gone off the deep end. Then we found that yoga was probably more effective than more psychiatric medications, but it didn't see a single psychopharm clinic turn into a yoga studio. So maybe data don't matter. And so, yes, I think psychiatry became a very sad profession.
And how many
because of
years ago
addiction
was
to
that?
medication. That was the 80s.
So since the 80s, people, I mean, how many millions of people are being prescribed these anti-anxiety and antidepressant medications?
Well, wait.
Controversy
Wait.
alert, controversy
She's
There are
going to defend
probably,
psychiatry.
wait a minute. There are probably a lot of people that you know that have been prescribed antidepressant medicine. They work for the purpose for which they are being prescribed, which is to suppress symptoms.
Right, that's right.
However, that is what we have to question, whether mental health healing is about suppressing symptoms. If you go to an average doctor and say, I gotta sleep, give me something to help me sleep, they will prescribe the drug that will help you sleep, that will suppress the insomnia so you can sleep. A different kind of provider might say, gee, I wonder why you can't sleep. What is up with that? And kind of go into it more deeply and try to wonder about what is blocking the sleep. So what is it that you want to accomplish? You're depressed, and you don't want to be depressed. You want a suppression of your depression. You're hyper-aroused, and you don't want to be hypervigilant. You don't want to startle. Yeah. You say to your doctor, I don't want to have these symptoms anymore. Doctor says, I got just the thing.
But
they write you a prescription. It's not that these medications don't work. It's that once they're prescribed, nobody ever takes you off of them because they're afraid that the symptoms will come back, because if that's the only thing that you're doing, that's probably true. If you're using the suppression of symptoms to do some work without interference, then this can be probably useful in the same way that taking a psychedelic is, or in a more muted way than taking a psychedelic is. You're kind of preventing yourself from getting too distressed. So again, I think, what is your goal? What did you tell the doctor that you want? I mean, these days, we do what the patient wants, right? It's patient-centered.
It depends on what you're suffering from. And that our diagnostic system is a pathetic diagnostic system. It has no scientific validity whatsoever.
But this isn't about that. This is about
it's also
listening
about
to
that.
people. And the person wants, I have to go to work. I can't be functioning this way.
That's right.
So, right. So the question, the deeper question is, what is it that you really want? Maybe it's not to suppress your symptoms. Maybe we should start telling our mental health providers that we want to heal, which is a word that actually makes a lot of doctors uncomfortable, believe it or not.
But some people respond very well to antidepressants. And it's
respond
great.
by suppressing the symptoms, not necessarily by changing who they are.
Some depressions are not trauma-based, and we wouldn't
Right.
know how to treat it any other way. And many people are very lucky to have found the right antidepressants, so they can function. That's all great.
Well, good. I'm glad I got you to turn around about SSRIs.
So it's not all evil. You know, it depends on what do people need and what's the basis of their symptoms, actually.
Right, but we don't want to demonize these medicines, because I think that when they're used with the right intentionality, they can be really helpful to people. I think, you know, my problem with them is that we don't understand for how long we will need to take these medicines, which is a problem, and that they cause a lot of side effects, and that sometimes people mistake taking a medicine for doing other kinds of psychological work that is less passive.
Have you seen people, for instance, in your work that are healed after a certain duration on the medication? Rachel, I'm gathering from you, you're saying it needs to be paired with therapies of some kind outside of just the medication. Bessel, have you seen people who just are cured by taking these medications?
Well, I did the original research on Prozac and Zoloft, and some people did very well at the end of the study.
And then you took them off and they stayed well?
By and large, and I've known people over many years who have done well with just antidepressants. It does happen. Yeah.
Do you think that, well, I'm sorry, I have to do a little flashback to last night because I was on the stage with Werner Herzog and I didn't get a chance to quote him from his memoir on this one particular thing. He has a line where he says, "I would rather die than go to an analyst." And then he says...
Well, I went to analysts, I almost died in the process.
He also says something to the effect that if you were to light every corner of a house brightly lit, it would become uninhabitable. And he says that is the same with the soul. What do you make of that?
I wouldn't say
I should
that.
bring him back. Is Werner in the house?
No, that's really something we run into for the first time in my practice ever with psychedelic therapies, that people go into rooms that have never been lit up. And I haven't seen people who have been in our protocol with all the bells and whistles and the very careful environment that we create, who really have been hurt by having dark rooms lit up.
They have been hurt.
Yeah.
No, have not been hurt.
Oh, have not been hurt.
In our practice, hasn't happened.
No, but psychedelics don't work for everyone. The question of whether you're hurt by taking them if they don't work for you.
Oh, that's psychoanalysis, not psychedelics. Sorry.
Psychoanalysis.
Yes, he was saying about psychoanalysis.
Well, I always like to say, understanding why you're fucked up doesn't make you less fucked up. Now that I know where you're fucked up.
It doesn't.
So I do want to talk about these.
It's a good start, though, no?
What?
It's a good start.
You like that?
I mean, you know, that now you sound like a behaviorist. I mean, I think that's a
Sorry,
really
say that
interesting...
again, about being a behaviorist?
Well, if understanding why you're messed up doesn't change anything, then maybe you're a behaviorist who thinks that just having a set of tools and techniques that give you skills and coping strategies and behavioral skills will change the game for
I've
you.
never been good at managing other people. You know, I do CBT with my wife all the time. And I explain to her
Isn't that just called arguing?
how her thinking is really irrational. And she's never grateful for my superior insights.
Can we talk a little bit about these therapies? I'm glad you brought up CBT. Not everyone is well-versed in the different methodologies that are out there. Can you just give a brief explanation of what CBT is for people?
Well, I don't do CBT. Maybe you can because you're closer to it. Yeah.
CBT stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. And cognitive behavioral therapies are extremely directed approaches that are designed to address core specific issues in a very systematic way. They can be very helpful when the problem is really known and it's circumscribed. For example, for something like obsessive compulsive disorder, you have rituals and stuff like that. You know, you can well, they're more effective than anything else. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
but
OCD is a
nothing is
hard
particularly
one.
effective for OCD.
But what is?
Yeah. No, OCD is a
Is
very
this a tough one?
effective one.
You're saying that
but
the
it is a
CBT doesn't
first-line treatment. People consider cognitive behavioral therapies the first-line treatment for PTSD too, meaning that if you, let's say you know the trauma, and let's say it is a very focused, circumscribed trauma, and let's say the problem you have is that you're very triggered by the memory of the trauma, presumably by walking through a cognitive behavioral protocol, at the end of the 10 or 12 weeks, you will become desensitized to your traumatic narrative or habituated to it. Or in cognitive processing therapy, you will be challenged as to your beliefs about the trauma, such as things like you are to blame for the fact that they happened, etc. So for certain kind of traumas, which I call blip on the screen traumas, even though they can be very serious traumas like interpersonal violence, like your life is generally good, you're you're intact, everything is fine, something terrible happens. A course of cognitive behavioral therapy can work out really well for you. And that's why it is a first-line treatment for PTSD. The problem is that most people who have pretty serious mental health problems, including PTSD, are more complex. They have complex PTSD because a lot of things have happened to them. They can't just pick one thing. They don't just have a few symptoms. They're all over the place. And for those kind of cases, and if a trauma involves moral injury or those kinds of experiences, the cognitive behavioral model often doesn't yield the same results and can be distressing in that they require a narration of traumatic material that not everybody may be up for,
So
especially depending on the trauma.
Exposure isn't always such a great thing, and you don't believe...
So let me tell you how I really became a researcher into PTSD after doing psychopharm research, is that because people in my clinic were having great success with a very bizarre method called EMDR.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about
EMDR is as bizarre as it gets.
Eye movement,
eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and you ask people to remember what they saw, what they felt, but you don't ask people to talk about it. And as people go there, you ask them to follow your fingers as you move your fingers from side to side about in front of you. How bizarre can you be? And so we saw people getting better. And we went to NIH, and with Rachel's help, you're very important in that grant, we got the grant, only grant ever to study EMDR, and we had dramatic results with this bizarre method. And then we tried to get the money to study what happens in the brain. It took us about 20 years of stealing from other grants to finally do that study. And what we found is that moving your eyes around changes the circuitry of the brain and allows your brain to engage in a different way. So it started off being bizarre, but at the end it turned out to be something remarkable in terms of you change circuitry of engagement with material in the brain. But it took a long time to study that.
Do you think that something about the eye movement has some connection to evolutionary biology or some
I have no
deeper
idea,
habit
actually.
or motor function of the brain?
You know, I travel a lot. I go to a lot of miserable places in the world and see what people do. And I find that in other places, people do very different things. Where you go to Sichuan, people do Qigong for PTSD. And they used to do Qigong with people, and they seem to benefit from it. And you go to India, and people do yoga for PTSD. So we are caught in our Western paradigm of yakking and drugs.
Yeah. No.
Just-
Wait a minute, Bessel. So the answer to the question about the eye movements is that you can test that hypothesis.
Yes, you
because
can.
you can do what is called a dismantling study.
Yes, you can.
And what a dismantling study is I'll give one way, I'll do the instructions and do the EMDR with the eye movements, and another group will be randomized to a condition where I'll do everything exactly the same way, but I'm not going to do the eye movements. So, and then you see which group has a better outcome. And you know what the results of those studies are, right? Why don't you tell them?
No, but...
The results are that you don't need the eye movement. So there isn't something magical about the eye movement, but maybe the eye movement facilitates a process in clinical practice because it gives you a focus. The idea, it's not that much different than how psychedelics work in that it is helping you get into an internal state where you can bring something up. It's not saying, I want you to think about this thing. That's really what I think both you and I, where we agree is the limitation of current approaches. You have to go in with a specific trauma narrative, but for most people, the job is they have to find it. So with EMDR, you're creating a condition that is conducive to allowing that memory to come. Now, maybe there's something about a therapist doing this, maybe, of course, changes the brain, but we don't know if that is why it works.
No, we don't know.
Right.
And you say, yes, you can study it, but I wrote 5 grants to NIH to study the mechanism of EMDR we didn't get the grant. So if there's no money,
That's a different
you cannot
story.
study it. you know.
That's a completely different issue.
Yeah.
But for
No,
the
it's
people
not
that
completely
studied
different,
it,
yeah,
that was the legitimate question that they asked. And that was the answer that they got. So, but it illustrates something really important, because you can have a brain change related to something, but that might not be the thing that is causing the internal change that people are experiencing. That could be besides the point, true and unrelated. Yeah. What I think is really powerful about EMDR is that it doesn't insist that you know what's wrong. Sure. It sets a stage for you to maybe explore it, and clinicians that work with it and patients that have had it report that it's really useful and it's tolerable. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's a really important thing. Now, the cognitive behavioral people say, well, it's just another form of exposure therapy.
It's not.
They want to co-opt it of, yes, of course, it's a systematized way. It's just we're not saying the words out loud, but you're exposing yourself to your own traumatic material.
In your writings, I remember very specifically, Bessel, you were describing that you were trying at first, you were asking probing questions about the problem, and you were kind of chastised for that by the patient, and you had to sort of train yourself to say, hold that thought, but not to ask what the thought was, not to necessarily probe. So in that sense, you were saying you were coming to the idea that it wasn't exposure therapy because you weren't forcing them to tell you. It wasn't about what you understood about the patient.
It's not about whether I approve of you or I think you're good. It's really facilitating people go deep inside of themselves. But the other interesting thing about the EMDR study was that, so Rachel was part of it, and we measured serum cortisol. And we found absolutely no relationship between people's clinical improvement and their cortisol. So we have these great biological markers, but the biological didn't change, even though the mental changes were very dramatic.
I can't believe how the time is flying, because I had this whole intention of specifically drilling down onto cortisol with Rachel, but we might have to miss some of that conversation, because I would really love before
Just have us back sometime.
Yes, I would love to, and I would love to. I would love to maybe have you in a recording studio where we could talk all day, but I do want to drill into a little bit about the psychedelics, because I think this is something that's very interesting for people, whereas in, I think you said the 80s, a lot of these serotonin reuptake inhibitors became very popular, but psychedelics were classified as Schedule I drugs and research was ground to a halt. And even now, some of the psychedelics that people are talking about with microdosing and different experiences are limited by that still. Isn't that true? A lot of the ketamine experiments, how much is that because ketamine is a better drug than the others that are still restricted?
Ketamine is legal and the other ones aren't.
It's legal. Is that the only reason? Can you say a little more about that?
I would think so. I wonder what Gita thinks about it, but I think that's...
Hi, Gita. Yeah. I think I saw her in the front row. Hi, sweetie.
Yeah. What I've told Rick Doblin is that his is the original PTSD therapy. He started in 1985. That was before Prozac. That was before the SSRIs. Yeah. He had the idea of using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD.
And that's not legal.
It wasn't, but he was doing clinical trials, so it was...
Is it legal now?
No, but it will be soon. We hope that it will be federally approved. But many people can get these treatments through research protocols. So in our
center... And there's a big underground world, of course.
So that's
another thing completely.
It's a reality, though, that it's there,
I know
people say to me all the
guy.
time, it doesn't matter what your research shows because people will be doing it because we have access to these drugs.
The problem, though, is that we don't have an evidence base because what happens in the underground stays in the underground. And so you certainly anecdotally have a lot of reports of people saying, this saved my life. When we hear reports of people saying, this was a disaster for me, we tend to suppress those voices.
Oh,
we don't want to hear it. Yeah. Now, in research, we can systematically ask the question. Now,
Absolutely.
we're having pretty good outcomes, I have to say, better
And you're
than I
studying
thought.
specifically MDMA, not ketamine.
We're studying MDMA, and we're also studying psilocybin. And, you know, I was a little nervous about that. I thought psilocybin was this very disembodied experience. How are people with extreme trauma going to do? And so far, they've done really well. And so there is something about being in an altered state, in the right kind of environment that seems to be helpful. But the problem of relying only on anecdotal evidence from the underground
absolutely,
is that you just won't know.
So ketamine, I mean, do you believe that ketamine is specifically better than the others? And why was it deregulated sooner?
No, it wasn't deregulated. Ketamine is an anesthetic agent. It was never illegal. And so people accidentally discovered it had certain psychedelic properties if given in low doses. But the hero of the story is indeed Vic Doblin, who collected $64 million to do the lousy study, of which I was part of the study. And the vets didn't produce a penny, and he just raised a lot of money to produce the evidence. And the evidence had to be created, absolutely.
And do you think that these will be open to other people as real therapies? I think one of the real frustrations reading about this, which was interesting to me, is sort of some failures of talk therapy on their own, many failures of some of these prescribed drugs, but no access to somatic therapies that involve what everyone, like two experts on stage tonight, are saying are the most beneficial that we have on our horizon. And when do you think that will change?
I not until we have a revolution and we have universal healthcare. As long as we have, as long as your insurance companies dictate what you can practice, the field will be dead, basically, because there's only stuff for which people have raised $64 million that can produce the evidence. And like Peter Levine, who does wonderful work with the body, he doesn't have a shred of evidence. A lot of very good treatments don't have very much evidence because there's no money to study it, and the insurance companies won't reimburse you for it. So,
do you think that social pressure, that pressure from consumers, from people, can affect
social
change?
pressure, as in completely retooling our medical system? Yes.
Well,
big.
It's not quite that simple. In order to be a psychedelic therapist, Bessel, honestly, you have to learn how to do something that we don't do now in mental health, which is follow the process of patients. This isn't what they teach in graduate school, and it isn't what they teach in medical school. And we need to really start at the level we have to get people in medical school and in graduate school understanding that there's a different way of practicing. The revolution isn't just money. This is about changing hearts of mind. This is about culture and education. And then what we have to do is insist that these treatments be reimbursable and affordable, which is something that I'm worried about a little bit. And they are expensive treatments because you're sitting with a trained professional for 8-10 hours for a session. That's their livelihood. They have to charge you by the hour. But how could we work this out so that it's more like a procedure? People spend 7-8 hours on an operating table. Insurance reimburses tens and tens of thousands of dollars for what happened that day, involving many, many, many people working together to do something because they think that that's an important part of someone's wellness. The real issue is that we don't take mental health seriously.
But
and we have to take it as seriously as we take cancer or any of the other things
but
that people
producing
go to
the evidence
doctors
is terribly
for.
important. If I were an insurance company, I wouldn't want to fund stuff either for which there is no evidence. So collecting the evidence is also very important.
So that's why we're doing the research.
Yeah.
We're involved in that. I'm involved in that. And it's not easy research to do. But we will not be able to get insurance companies to even consider this without research. So for all you people that want to have psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, try to find a research protocol so that you could be part of the reason that other people get to have this reimbursed in the future.
Do you yourselves have a kind of practice? You both talk about somatic therapies and practices. I believe you've both said things to the effect that it took people a long time to consider that there was another way to change the mind and the brain outside of drugs. You've mentioned yoga and you've mentioned some of these practices. Do either of you have a personal practice?
Oh, I have a clinical practice. My favorite treatment actually is psychodrama.
Is which?
Psychodrama. Sometimes I combine psychodrama with ketamine, with Gita. Very powerful, actually. People have profoundly different experiences. That seems to last. I do a lot of neurofeedback in my own practice. We do body work. My wife, Lisha, is a spectacular body worker and is part of our team. We do all kinds of stuff. But again, we treat people who don't have to go through insurance companies. And if we went through insurance companies, I would have to lie through my teeth to tell them what I'm doing.
Well, now you've just told everyone here, so that's sort of out of the bag. And you, Rachel, do you have a personal practice for yourself?
Well, I kind of like yoga, and I think that breathing is really a very good form of practice. I think it's really about whether you can regulate your breath and your body and really calm your own body down. And I think that those things have been ignored in traditional medicine. Psychodrama was my first degree, as you know. I studied that in college.
Did you?
And yeah, before I thought I could really do science, probably. But I was very drawn to it. I think that it is one of the quickest and most powerful ways to get at a lot of stuff, because if you give somebody a role to play and they're playing a role and it's not them, it all comes out anyway. It's very similar to what happens in a facilitated journey, and they're shocked more than anyone else at how they played the role and what comes out. But again, psychodrama is also very powerful. And I think it can bring up a lot of stuff that then needs to be processed. So I think all that's true. The somatic therapies, I think, just have been really underemphasized in medicine. I think we like to talk and we like to give medicine. But I think increasingly people are recognizing their utility, and what they're certainly seeing is that clients are seeking out somatic therapies, and then they're saying, well, I don't get it. Why are they doing body work when they could talk to me? But that's what's really happening out there. And I think that, again, there hasn't been enough research investment. I know you've tried. But I think that it is really important to be able to study these things.
It's very hard to protocolize the body work, actually. It'd be very difficult to specifically where you touch, how deeply you touch. We actually are funding a touch study right now in the laboratory, big study on touch.
You also
it's really a function of the specific provider also, which is very hard for a field. Because, you know, some people are just more naturally inclined to be healing presences than others, and that's and those people aren't doing research probably in academic settings.
Different temperaments.
Since we're running towards the hour, I just also, because I think it's very relevant for this audience and this place and this program that we've sort of started here instinctively and sometimes aren't exactly sure why we're doing it and what we're doing. But you've said, Bessel, in your book, you said the capacity of art, music, and dance to transcend speechlessness is quite underestimated. And I think that that's a lot of what you're referring to. And it's something we kind of instinctively know, but we somehow need validation from authorities to tell us what we kind of intuitively
Yeah, you
already
know, what
feel in our
struck me
bodies.
is that, like, I sent my kids to a really nice school in Boston. They had a lot of theater, a lot of music, a lot of athletics. They got to do the things that makes your body feel alive and have fun. And they never had to push them to study because kids like to learn. What did you do in public schools? First thing you abolish is theater. And the music program,
Or
and the dance
running
program,
around
and the athletic
outside.
programs, and all that stuff about making your body feel alive gets suppressed because they want to score better, as good as the kids in Korea. But the kids in Korea actually get to do dancing and singing and theater, which our kids don't get to do as a consequence. So I think our educational world needs an enormous amount of education about the development of the mind and the body, actually.
And maybe, Rachel, you could also just, do you feel that there's a role culturally for this gathering as part of transforming sort of what might be kind of an epidemic of mental illness or a sense of being mentally unwell?
Well, I think when it comes to trauma-related things, we have too heavy a reliance on mental health professionals, and too little a reliance on community, society, and culture. You know, that it's just ridiculous. Thank you. It's just ridiculous to think that a social worker or a psychiatrist or someone like that can solve some of the problems that are really systemic failures of being isolated and not having community support, or not being engaged in something that's enjoyable or meaningful or something like that. I mean, you can go and talk about it with someone, but where is community? And so if we're really going to have a healing culture, we're going to have to transform schools, like you say, and really, you know, figure out, maybe churches are not for everyone, but houses of spirituality need to be created so that people really can get from each other what they think they can, but can't really get from a single mental health provider. And so all of that stuff's been completely absent from the discussion. And so if we're a healing society, then I think that will go a long way towards helping people repair from trauma wounds.
I could talk to both of you all night, and I'm actually intending to do that to both of you later. But I realize where we are on this evening and this stage, and I just want to ask everyone to join me in thanking our spectacular guests tonight. Now, before we completely disband, my guests kindly agreed to take a very few questions. I do believe that there's a microphone over here. If you can line up, we're going to take very few questions as opposed to raised hands. Sorry, because the microphone's at a stand. But I do want to say questions only, no free therapy sessions, and no personal stories. Thank you.
Good evening. Could you talk more about the danger of re-traumatization that can happen when going into alternate states of consciousness without a container properly held?
Yeah, that is really the great concern that both Rachel and I are talking about, is that we administer our psychedelics. People get 36 hours of psychotherapy in addition to the psychedelic administration, actually. So we're extraordinarily attentive to the relationship and creating a safe place, etc., etc. And we are worried to death about people sitting in little cubicles being given a substance that will blow their mind and then be sent home without any contact with anybody else. That's really our greatest concern, or at least my greatest concern. I think yours also, in a way.
You can have a flashback if you're a trauma survivor.
Yeah.
You can have a very uncomfortable experience and feel like you might be going crazy or feel like something is wrong. And having somebody there that can kind of monitor it and give you the right feedback can help you get through the experience. I mean, psychedelics are very powerful tools.
I'll give you an example. During one of my own MDMA experiences that I needed to have to become a PR to study, I experienced myself as a 1-year-old. How accurate that is, God knows, but I was born in 1943, and in 1944, half my generation starved to death, and I barely made it. And I felt what it was like for that little baby, whose mother was totally overwhelmed, who was basically dying. It was a very painful experience. It was something I always knew was buried inside of me. It came out. It was very painful, and I had wonderful sitters with me who made it tolerable to go to that memory. If I had it by myself, I might have killed myself. These are very serious things that you lead people to, and that's true for all of our patients. They go through very, very dark places, and you need to be really held, really cared for. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your question. Please.
Hi. So I appreciate the emphasis you're putting on preparation and integration. I'm a coach myself, and I help people prepare for and integrate these experiences. My question specifically, and I've seen this, and I wonder if you've seen this in your research, if people are healing physical issues when using psychedelics, because we're talking about the connection between trauma and the body and our physical experience. And I just have seen some incredible things, but we haven't talked about that yet tonight.
We'd start there. I have thoughts about it, but when you start.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, blood pressure can shoot up, for example, pretty high. And people can experience a lot of shaking. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Actually, physical healing as a result of dealing with this trauma or dealing with things less than trauma.
Physical? No.
Well, I think people have a lot of somatic experiences during the psychedelic experiences. And also, I'm actually getting more and more intrigued with the possibility of psychedelics being able to reshape the core stress response. And a lot of people suffer from psychological somatic illnesses, fibromyalgias, muscle issues, autoimmune diseases. And I'm really very curious to what degree going through this quieting psychedelic experience might actually reset these very deep brain structures that send signals to the body, you're in danger, that keeps physical symptoms going. I think that's a very important next frontier of our research, to what degree these substances can quiet down the ongoing stress responses that our bodies generate.
And you think it can be permanently rewired in some sense?
It's an empirical question.
It's possible.
A very important empirical question.
And to Rachel's point, if we can't study it, we can't answer it.
That's right.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. Psychedelic therapy is very controversial in the sobriety communities, of which I'm a part of. And as somebody who's many years sober, who used to do a lot of psychedelics, and who's very curious about psychedelic therapy, are there specific concerns, encouragements, things to look out for, warnings, etc.?
Well, Bill W. actually sort of got into trouble at the end of his life because he became a big LSD advocate and the rest of the group didn't. But I certainly don't have the expertise to address that, and maybe, do you have some things to say about it?
And this is definitely a concern in our patient population, veterans. We haven't seen that this increases the desire for substance use in any way. In fact, most people say, okay, I'm not doing that again. But I think I don't want to be too cavalier about it either. I think that it's something that needs to be weighed against the reason that you need to take the psychedelic. So I think
Can it also be useful as a tool for handling addiction or for
Yes.
thwarting addiction?
Yes, but that has to be done in a very specific way.
But so the first wave of psychedelic research occurred in the 60s, and most people don't read the literature. There were some very good papers about treatment of addiction with LSD, but that sort of got wiped out. But it looked very promising at that time. And if I were running a drug addiction program, I would certainly practice both neurofeedback, which also has a track record, doesn't get practiced, and I would very seriously look at psychedelics as a way of changing people's minds. And it's really how psychedelics, they change your mind, as Marco Pollan says. And it may, we see people anecdotally inside of our studies, we don't focus on that, who actually give up their addictive behaviors because their mind becomes quiet. But to what degree that's across the board needs to be studied.
I don't remember who it was I read in, I think it was your work, Rachel, somebody said, I found myself thinking so honestly, which is such an unusual quote, thinking so honestly.
That is a quote from Sasha Shulgin, who gave an interview about MDMA. I have that on one of my slides. I might have sent it. And that is why he became very interested in MDMA, because of just the honesty of what that brought forth to him.
I feel so bad for everyone in this line. I can only take one more question, but I know that Bessel will be signing books. I'm really sorry about that, but you can also write to us, and we will try to integrate it into our radio interview that we're now planning to do to ask more questions, please.
Thank you. So I think as interest in psychedelics in the popular culture has become more and more mainstream in certain circles, I've noticed, even though access to the clinical trials and more formal guided facilitated sessions is limited, friends, my mother, family are all interested in these more spiritual ceremonies where they're traveling to South America, to Mexico, and engaging in psychedelic activities that may not necessarily follow what we understand through evidence today. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that and the contribution to psychedelic progress.
Thank you, Bessel.
I can say something.
Should we have just talked about psychedelics the whole time?
Yeah,
Sounds like it.
I got to it a little too late.
I think that using psychedelics to have a spiritual experience or an opening of consciousness in these settings shouldn't be confused with treating a mental health condition. So I think, that's my only thing. This is one experience, and you're doing it for one purpose and one reason and one goal. And healing from a mental health problem is another thing, with maybe a different group of people in a different kind of way. So I think that's where our discussions about psychedelics kind of get very confusing, because many people are interested in psychedelics, they're curious about them, they've had deeply profound experiences or really fun ones or anything like that, and they don't necessarily have a mental health problem, and then the conversation about mental health may not necessarily be relevant. Maybe it is a little, or the conversation just becomes very different. So I hope that one day these will be available consciousness-raising spiritual experiences for all those who wish to have them, and that our society is built in a way to help people process and integrate whatever comes up for them. And I also hope separately that these can be developed as tools for mental health and be taken seriously and reimbursed.
My take on it is that when you do psychedelic agents, it's almost inevitable to get spiritual experiences. And in the world that particularly Rachel lives in, but I live in to some degree also, talking about spirituality is really something that you're not allowed to do that. That's not part of our scientific attitude. So we leave that out. And I really admire the Johns Hopkins people, Roland Griffiths in particularly, who have been able to talk about spirituality in their psilocybin research, even though they're in the main academic institution. And it's impossible to leave spirituality out because it's such a core part of the experience of psychedelics, where you feel yourself as being part of a much larger universe than just your individual organism. But how we integrate that with our NIH language is difficult. Yeah.
Bessel. That was a long time ago. I think things have really changed, and I know that even in the 90s, we were doing forgiveness groups with chaplains and and psychiatrists in the VA understanding full well that the power of the chaplain was even greater to some extent than the power of the therapist. That was in the 90s. And what has happened since then is whole health and spirituality. We have entire programs that are designed to dance and movement and meditation. One of our grants is on TM right now, and we're able to compare the biomarkers in the same way that we're doing for psychedelic work. So I think that really people are understanding the power of spirituality, especially when it comes to trauma. So I just don't think they know what to do, because other than use the word spirituality, it's not necessarily clear how you help people with that. And so people are very touchy and self-conscious about bringing up religion, for example. So you have to develop a very intimate relationship with someone that you're working with to know the guardrails of that. You don't want to offend someone. You don't want to take something for granted. But I think the medical community in particular is understanding that this has been missing from the table. And people like us that have understood this earlier on need to help them with that. So again, if your provider doesn't ask you about spirituality, then you should bring it up, because this is the way that it enters into the dialogue, and being able to seek out spiritual experiences, I think is going to become a lot more popular as these important medicines become available to people.
I have a feeling, Bessel, you have a reply that we we have to allow our guests to go have beautiful food in the garden, to look at Saturn and Jupiter and the moon and be reminded where you are in the universe. And I thank you both so very much for joining us tonight.